A beautiful CEO marries a humble man and uncovers a past that threatens everything. Before we dive into this gripping story, we invite you to like the video and subscribe to the channel to support our work. We hope you enjoy it. She was the CEO of a business empire. He was a widowed father doing his best to keep life together. What began as a marriage of convenience turned into a fight for power, redemption, and hidden truths no one was prepared to face. Victoria Hayes, CEO of the Hayes Group, was under the greatest pressure of her life. Her family was demanding that she marry a pre-approved heir to secure strategic alliances. Tired of sacrificing her autonomy for outside interests, she came up with an alternative, one that would let her retain control over the empire she had helped build. Her plan was straightforward. Find an ordinary man, completely detached from the corporate world, who would agree to a one-year marriage in exchange for financial security and the stability he needed to raise his daughter. That way, she could escape the family's blackmail and shut down the arrangement with a powerful Lane family. Daniel Brooks seemed like the ideal fit. A modest man, former military, living with dignity and limited means alongside his daughter Emily. When Victoria first approached him, he didn't quite understand why a woman like her would choose him. But the proposal was clear: 1 year of marriage, total discretion, a stable home for Emily, and a generous payout once the agreement ended. Daniel initially declined, wary of the consequences. But when Emily fell ill and the cost of treatment exceeded his means, he reconsidered. He knew it wasn't a conventional choice, but it might be the only way to give his daughter a better shot at life. On the day they signed the contract, they met in a neutral space, cold and formal. Victoria maintained a firm, impersonal stance. Daniel arrived with Emily in his arms, his face unreadable and his demeanor reserved. When Emily saw Victoria, she ran toward her and called her mommy. The moment sent a jolt through the room. Clearly embarrassed, Daniel explained that Emily had no real memory of her biological mother and sometimes assigned that role to women who made her feel safe. Despite the unexpected scene, Victoria proceeded with the paperwork without flinching, determined to stay focused on her goals. Once the documents were signed, Victoria made it official. She was married. The news shocked the Hayes family, but served its purpose. It dissolved the arranged marriage with Christopher Lane. Daniel was instructed to stay out of the spotlight, while Victoria continued managing the company without interruption. She believed everything was under control. Her work routine remained untouched, but Emily's presence began to create subtle cracks in her otherwise flawless structure. The quiet of her home slowly gave way to laughter, crayon drawings scattered around, and innocent questions, things that had never been part of her rigid, scheduled world. In the days that followed, Victoria found herself spending more and more time with Emily. The curious, uninhibited little girl began to break through the emotional walls she had carefully built over the years. Crayon sketches left on her desk, simple questions about her day. These little gestures made Victoria think twice about the cold, calculated way she had approached this decision. Gradually, real bonds began to form between them, even though she had no idea how to deal with it. The contractual arrangement was beginning to shift into something far more complicated and unpredictable. Emily was filling spaces Victoria didn't even know had been empty, and she found herself caught between being a no-nonsense businesswoman and someone slowly learning how to nurture. Meanwhile, Daniel was doing his best to stick to the terms, stay out of business matters, respect boundaries. But with each passing encounter with Victoria, he could feel the dynamic subtly changing. He kept his words measured, but he noticed everything about her. She wasn't just a powerful executive. He saw someone who also carried scars. And he, with his own, could recognize when two wounded souls started to see themselves in one another. They didn't say much, but something unspoken was beginning to grow between them, a quiet understanding that deepened with each day. The second month of living together began with an unexpected invitation to a charity event in the business world. For protocol's sake, Victoria was expected to bring her husband. Daniel, uncomfortable with being in the spotlight, tried to decline, but Emily convinced him otherwise. She thought it was fun to see the two of them dressed up in formal wear. On the night of the event, all eyes were on the couple. While Victoria mingled with business partners, Daniel kept a low profile, avoiding unnecessary interaction. It was in this setting that Claire Hayes made her entrance, instantly commanding attention with her presence. The ballroom, up until then steeped in formality, seemed to pause for a brief moment. Claire was Victoria's half-sister, estranged from the family since her youth. Their reunion was polite, but heavy with unspoken tension. When Claire caught sight of Emily, her gaze lingered. She remarked that there was something oddly familiar about the little girl. Daniel, noticing Claire's expression, froze for a moment. Claire recognized him, even if her memory struggled to form a clearer picture. The fragments were disjointed, but she felt certain that this man was tied to an unresolved chapter of her past. The polished atmosphere took on a subtle heaviness, charged with something unspoken. Victoria didn't miss the shift. Back at the mansion, she asked Daniel directly about his connection to Claire. He hesitated, then simply said they had crossed paths once, years ago, at a charity event. The explanation was vague, and Victoria sensed it, but she chose not to press the issue for now. Still, something about Claire's reappearance felt too deliberate to be chance, and her growing bond with Emily made it all harder to ignore. The balance of their contractual marriage was starting to unravel. Questions piled up in Victoria's mind, but she decided to keep them to herself for now. A week later, Claire showed up unannounced at the Hayes Group headquarters. She brought an envelope filled with old letters, documents, and photographs. She said she needed to talk about secrets the family had kept hidden. She explained that she had gotten pregnant years ago by a man whose name she never revealed and had been forced to leave to avoid scandal. Her stories came out in pieces, full of names and events Victoria barely remembered. But slowly, the puzzle began to form, and the picture it revealed was unsettling. Victoria's usual emotional detachment began to crack as she read each line. Daniel found out about Claire's visit through Emily, who casually mentioned seeing the sad aunt at the office. He realized he couldn't keep his past hidden much longer. That night, he approached Victoria and, without deflecting, told her he had met Claire years ago. They had had a brief relationship, and she had vanished without explanation. He insisted he never knew she was a Hayes. Victoria listened without interrupting, taking in every word with a calm that betrayed no emotion. When he finished, she simply nodded and stood up, offering no commentary. In the days that followed, the dynamic between Victoria and Daniel grew noticeably colder. They continued to fulfill the terms of their agreement, but avoided talking beyond what was strictly necessary. Emily, sensitive to the shift in atmosphere, became quieter. The home that had begun to feel like a real family space took on a tense, uneasy tone. The facade of marriage, once on the verge of becoming something genuine, slid back into its original form, an arrangement built on distance. There were no arguments, no harsh words, but everything had changed. Even their glances no longer carried the ease they once shared. On a muggy Monday morning, Victoria received an unexpected call from Emily's school. The academic coordinator sounded urgent, requesting that the child's guardians come in immediately to clarify an incident that had occurred during recess. Without hesitation, Victoria and Daniel made their way to the school, both trying to imagine what could have possibly happened. Upon arrival, they were met by a tense-looking teacher who led them to the courtyard, where Emily sat on a bench off to the side, crying quietly, her eyes red and her knees scraped. Next to her, another child, visibly hurt, was being tended to by a staff member. The teacher explained that there had been a fight. Emily had stepped in to defend a classmate who was being bullied repeatedly, and in the scuffle, she had pushed the son of one of the school's major donors, causing him to fall and get hurt. The meeting with the administration was tense and uncomfortable. The principal presented the situation as unacceptable, implying that Emily might not be emotionally equipped to handle the school's competitive environment. Daniel reacted immediately, pushing back against the judgment and demanding that the incident be investigated fairly. Victoria, calm but firm, insisted on access to witness statements and security footage. The tension escalated even further when the injured boy's parents arrived. They were the Montclairs, well-known members of the American business elite and longtime acquaintances of the Hayes family. Their presence brought weight to the situation that went far beyond a playground incident, and the tone of the conversation quickly crossed into unreasonable territory. During the discussion, the boy's mother cast a thinly veiled look of contempt at Daniel. In a sarcastic tone, she remarked that he probably wasn't used to institutions of that caliber, implying that his presence there must have come through some form of favoritism. Daniel kept his composure, staying quiet until she took aim at Emily, at which point he stood up and, in a firm voice, declared he would not allow anyone to belittle his daughter, especially when she had acted to defend another child. The tension spiked, and Victoria stepped in before things escalated further. She made it clear to everyone in the room that any retaliation against Emily would result in the immediate withdrawal of financial support from the Hayes Group, and that the school's reputation would suffer if the matter wasn't handled with the seriousness it deserved. On the ride home, silence filled the car. Victoria, jaw still tight, muttered about the absurd way the Montclairs had behaved and how the school, supposedly one of the best, bowed so easily to those who funded its fundraisers. Daniel didn't respond, but his hands gripping the steering wheel betrayed his thoughts. When they arrived, they found Emily sitting on the living room rug, eyes downcast, clutching a new toy tightly. Daniel knelt in front of her and softly told her she had done the right thing by standing up for someone who needed help. Emily didn't reply at first, but then wrapped her arms around her father in a long, wordless hug. That night, Victoria went up to Emily's room and stayed there, sitting at the edge of the bed after quietly reading a story aloud. For once, her mind couldn't shut off. The child's presence in her life had grown into something she could no longer explain through logic or strategy. It wasn't just a convenient arrangement anymore. Emily stirred parts of her that had been dormant for years. Back downstairs, Victoria found Daniel in the kitchen. He didn't say anything when she came in. They sat across from each other at the table, sharing a silence that no longer felt awkward, but rather full of meaning they hadn't yet found the words for. In the following days, Victoria got personally involved with the school administration to make sure no disciplinary action will be taken against Emily. Footage from the security cameras confirmed the story. Emily had indeed stepped in to protect another student, and the boy involved had been bullying for weeks. Victoria's firm stance, along with her influence, kept the school from issuing any formal punishment. But the emotional aftermath lingered. Emily had become more withdrawn. Daniel avoided the school grounds altogether, and Victoria, though focused on resolving the matter, carried an unease that no rational argument could soothe. The dynamic between the three of them had shifted, and while no one said it aloud, they all felt it. Life at the Hayes household slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy after the incident at school. Though conversations became more frequent, and Emily seemed visibly relieved, The atmosphere between Victoria and Daniel remained suspended in an unspoken truce. Neither of them brought up recent events. They focused strictly on the obligations laid out in their contract. Their day-to-day interactions were limited to professional commitments, brief exchanges regarding Emily, and silences too prolonged to feel incidental. The little girl, though unaware of the full context, sensed the distance. She no longer asked to have dinner together or waited for bedtime stories. She simply observed. It was during this period that Victoria received a formal notice from the law firm managing her family's estate. The official reading of her grandfather's will, who had passed away months earlier, had been scheduled. Victoria already knew part of its content, but certain clauses tied to her marital status could only be disclosed once the marriage had been formally validated. She chose to bring Daniel along. It wasn't required, but she wanted to maintain consistency in their arrangement. In the polished offices of the firm, the attorney read through each clause with precision. The main revelation concerned a historic estate in Virginia, which would be transferred to Victoria on the condition that her marriage lasted a full 12 months and was publicly acknowledged. Daniel said nothing during the reading, but his expression hardened at the end when the lawyer handed him an envelope addressed to him by Victoria's grandfather. Inside was a short handwritten letter. Though brief, the message was weighty. You may not understand it now, but I trusted you beyond the contract. Take care of my granddaughter. Protect what truly matters. Daniel didn't share the note with Victoria at that moment. He tucked it into his pocket and simply nodded when she asked if everything was all right. They returned home with few words exchanged, each absorbed in their own reflections about duty, inheritance, and the deeper implications behind the arrangement. The next day, Victoria was surprised by an unannounced visitor. Lauren Lane, the man her family had expected her to marry, showed up in her conference room, demanding a private conversation. Whatever formality he'd intended dissolved quickly. Lauren brought up stalled business deals, frozen agreements, and concerns about the family name, all tied to her inexplicable marriage to Daniel. He urged her to end it before more reputational damage was done. Victoria remained composed. She ended the conversation firmly, making it clear that any form of coercion or defamation would be met with legal and institutional consequences. That evening, Victoria recounted the encounter with Lauren. She stuck to the facts, avoiding emotional color. Daniel listened quietly, leaning against the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed. When she finished, he pulled the note from his pocket and placed it on the table. Victoria read it in silence. She stared at the page for a few moments, eyes unmoving. Then, with a steady voice, she admitted she wasn't sure she had the strength to face what might still come. Daniel told her that while he didn't know where all of this would lead, he would continue to do his part, not as a favor, but out of respect for what they had built so far, no matter how fragile it seemed. In the days that followed, speculation in the media surged. Business blogs and gossip columns began publishing insinuations about their marriage, portraying it as a ploy to distract from internal scandals at the Hayes Group. Some even floated the theory that Emily was the illegitimate daughter of a high-profile financier. With mounting pressure, Victoria quietly launched an internal investigation at the company. Meanwhile, Daniel worked to shield Emily from online rumors and whispering at school. The perceptive little girl didn't ask many questions, but she stopped wanting to leave the house. During a meeting with her legal team, Victoria received an anonymous tip. The sender claimed Lauren Lane was funding journalists and consulting firms to deliberately sabotage her public image. The accusation aligned with the sudden withdrawal of 2 foreign investors and the cancellation of key commercial partnerships. Cracks were beginning to show in the company's foundation. It became clear to Victoria that her contract with Daniel, once a practical solution, had to evolve into something else entirely. A visible shield against the subtle but strategic attacks from those who still wielded power behind the scenes of the corporate elite. At the start of that week, Victoria called an emergency meeting with her board of directors. The room was full, but the atmosphere hovered somewhere between unease and anticipation. She got straight to the point, presenting the evidence her legal team had gathered on Lauren Lane's recent actions. She showed records of money transfers, contracts linking tabloid journalists to consulting firms acting on behalf of questionable interests. She wasn't asking for permission, she was informing them. Legal proceedings were already underway, and protecting the company's image was now urgent before rumors could become international headlines. Meanwhile, Daniel watched the fallout from a different angle. He noticed the whispers among other parents at school, the sideways glances during meetings, the quiet remarks that didn't escape Emily's perceptive ears. He began limiting her exposure, rearranging their routine to avoid uncomfortable situations. He observed Victoria closely but didn't intervene. He recognized a kind of focus in her, one that combined exhaustion with fierce determination. He didn't offer advice, just his presence. And that presence, quiet as it was, didn't go unnoticed. One particularly heavy night, Victoria got home later than usual. She found Daniel in the living room, with Emily asleep on the couch, her drawings scattered across the floor. He gently covered her with a blanket and, without a word, pointed to the table where he had left the latest reports from the investigation. Victoria sat down, read through everything carefully, and after a long pause, said there was a real chance she could open a formal lawsuit against Lauren. But doing so would mean exposing internal company documents and possibly implicating third parties still tied to important business dealings. Daniel listened quietly, then told her she needed to think carefully about how far she was willing to go. Not out of fear, but to preserve what still remained intact within the company. Victoria replied that the line of caution had already been crossed. What was left now was to decide how to move forward. In the following days, she began forging quiet alliances with key board members and brought in crisis management firms to control potential leaks. The tension in the company became palpable, and the once solid trust among executives started to crack under the pressure of what had come to light. At the same time, Claire resurfaced. She asked to meet Victoria away from the office, suggesting a low-profile cafe in a neighborhood rarely frequented by the press. There, she explained that Lauren had been reaching out to former allies of the Hayes family, trying to claw back influence and positioning. She also revealed that archived documents still existed in one of the family's old estates in Virginia, papers that could directly implicate not just Lauren, but other board members as well. Victoria listened with skepticism, but something about Claire was different this time. Less erratic, more resolute. That night, Victoria and Daniel discussed the possibility of going to Virginia together. It would be a short trip, but one that could completely shift the trajectory of the battle she was facing. The decision was made pragmatically. They would leave that weekend, with Emily staying under the care of a trusted employee. They prepared everything quietly, keeping their routine outwardly unchanged. On Saturday morning, they set out in an unmarked car, seated side by side in the front. The drive took them through highways and small towns, unfolding mostly in silence. But within that silence, there was a quiet understanding, a pact that no longer depended on the original contract to hold itself together. The old estate in rural Virginia appeared before them like a forgotten portrait from another time. The house's facade, still imposing, masked hairline cracks and windows dulled by layers of dust. It was as if time had stood still there, but not in a warm, nostalgic way. There was a stiffness embedded in the walls, something unresolved. Victoria unlocked the gates using a keychain inherited from her grandfather, and with Daniel's help, made her way through the hallways in search of the old study. Claire had mentioned that this was where important documents were likely stored, hidden in a wall safe behind the bookshelf lined with legal volumes. The search took less time than expected. The panel behind the bookshelf revealed itself easily, and Victoria entered the code she had remembered since childhood. The safe clicked open with a sharp sound. Inside were stacks of folders organized by date, each sealed with the Hayes Group emblem. Daniel helped remove the materials, and the two of them sat on the worn wooden floor, going through the documents one by one. Bit by bit, the contents began to form a pattern, evidence linking Laurent to illicit practices, off-the-books payments, rigged bids, market manipulation. The dates lined up with periods when the company had experienced critical instability. They pored over the papers for hours in silence. As the sun began to set, Victoria got up to make coffee in the home's old kitchen while Daniel continued reviewing the files. When she returned, she found an envelope set aside, her name written on it in her grandfather's handwriting. It was another letter. The message was clear and pointed, a warning about individuals on the board who, if left unchecked, could dismantle everything the family had built. Victoria read each line with care and, when she was done, handed it to Daniel. He gave a single nod in acknowledgement. They decided to take the documents back to New York, but not to hand them over to the authorities right away. Victoria intended to share part of the evidence with a trusted external auditor, someone fully independent, with no allegiances in the current corporate tug-of-war. The plan would be executed carefully to avoid further destabilizing the company's image. Daniel asked if she was truly prepared for what could follow. Victoria answered that it was no longer a question of being ready. It was a matter of doing what had to be done. On the drive back, the car cruised down quiet highways while Victoria scribbled notes into a leather-bound notebook. She was outlining the next steps with near-military precision. Daniel drove without rushing, stealing glances at her as she worked through the weight of her decisions. There was something different about her now. The way she spoke was more restrained, but also more resolute. By the time they pulled up in front of the building, dusk had settled in. Emily was waiting with a piece of paper in hand, a drawing of the three of them standing in front of the house surrounded by trees. Victoria held the drawing carefully while Daniel pinned it to the refrigerator. No words were exchanged. Emily darted off to fetch another sheet of paper, thrilled to have them both home. The apartment was quiet, but there was a kind of presence in the air that filled the space. Seated on the couch, Victoria watched Daniel and Emily talk about what they'd done while she was gone. It wasn't much, but it was enough for her to feel deeply that she was no longer facing this alone. The following morning, returning to New York's financial district brought back the weight of corporate tension Victoria had briefly left behind. The streets pulsed with traffic and hurried footsteps as she and Daniel stepped into the headquarters of the Hayes Group. They rode the polished steel elevator together, their distorted reflections in the mirrored walls making them look like figures from a distant narrative. Daniel held a folder containing copies of the most sensitive documents. Victoria stood tall, knowing this moment demanded not just clarity, but authority. When they entered the boardroom, the members, suited, punctual, and skeptical, were already seated, each one appearing poised for their carefully rehearsed role in a stage performance. Victoria opened her presentation with the company's financial reports and the most recent quarterly results. It was a strategic introduction, softening resistance before the heavier blows landed. She then presented performance graphs from the merged divisions and cross-reference data that revealed minor discrepancies, numbers that might once have been dismissed as operational noise. But as she transitioned into detailing the internal leaks, the atmosphere shifted. She projected copies of suspicious contracts, banking records, and the favor trading network trace from the Virginia documents, evidence pointing directly to Lawrence's allies on the board. No one interrupted. Eyes began to drift downward, arms crossed tightly, and feet fidgeted beneath the table. During a break requested by one of the members, Victoria and Daniel stepped into an adjoining lounge. She sank into a leather chair, kicked off her shoes, and closed her eyes as she took a slow, deliberate breath. Daniel remained standing, watching the boardroom through the tinted glass. He knew this wasn't rest. It was regrouping. She didn't need encouragement, only presence. When they were called back in, she slipped her shoes back on, straightened her blouse, and returned with the same composed expression she'd carried in. Once the session resumed, the questions came fast. Was she willing to relinquish some decision-making power to mitigate the scandal? Would the documents be turned over to the district attorney? Did she intend to name names publicly? Victoria answered each one head-on. She said she was there to protect the company, not the egos of its executives. She confirmed the documents had already been reviewed and logged by an independent auditor, and warned that any effort to suppress the investigation would be viewed as complicity. Her words didn't carry threat, but they were precise. With no safer alternative, the board voted to open an internal inquiry and authorize Victoria to lead the process with full authority. As they exited the building, the air felt heavier than cold. The city's usual noise carried on, and Daniel, waiting by the car, stepped forward to open the door for her. Victoria got in wordlessly, leaning her head against the seat and closing her eyes. Daniel drove in silence, not even turning on a radio. The world outside blurred into the background. When they arrived at the apartment, Emily was at the table with Claire, surrounded by colored pencils, working on a drawing. Upon seeing them, the little girl stood with a tired smile and asked if they could have dinner together that evening. Victoria gave a quiet nod. That simple question felt like an anchor of normalcy in the middle of the chaos. At dinner, no one spoke of the boardroom or the evidence. Emily talked about a science project at school. Claire helped prep ingredients in the kitchen, as if the tension in the air had temporarily lifted to make room for something softer. Daniel served Victoria's plate and sat beside her without asking anything. Later, when Emily fell asleep on the couch, he carried her to bed. Returning, he found Victoria still awake, gently stirring a cup of tea that had gone cold. She looked up at him with a calm expression, and he sat beside her. There was no need to speak about the day. It was enough just to be there, sharing a moment that asked for no defenses and no decisions. The next morning, Victoria stood before the glass walls of her office on the 31st floor of the corporate tower. The city buzzed below her, but her focus was locked on the stacked pages covering her desk. The preliminary report from the external auditor had arrived. It confirmed what the documents had suggested all along. Laurent was tied to phantom vendors, moving assets through offshore accounts, and colluding with board members to siphon funds from the Hayes Group's foundation. This went beyond corruption. It was a structured network threatening the company's very integrity. Victoria skimmed the conclusions, then immediately called in her attorney and the head of compliance for an emergency meeting. That afternoon, she convened an internal press briefing with the legal, financial, and communications departments. Her instructions were clear: initiate a contingency plan and prepare a public statement. Not a defensive posture, but a firm, forward-looking declaration. Nothing would be admitted outright. Not yet, but the company would announce a comprehensive audit to reaffirm its commitment to transparency. Every word mattered. The phrasing mattered even more. Daniel watched all this unfold from a distance, noting how quickly the situation was escalating. He wasn't part of her team, but every step she took rippled into their home life. Emily noticed the absences, the shifts in mood. And though Daniel had no voice in the company, he felt deeply affected by the consequences of it all. That evening, back at home, Victoria received an anonymous email with encrypted attachments. Inside were excerpts from private messages exchanged between two board members close to Lauren. They spoke openly about how to undermine her, question her leadership, and manipulate future votes. The plan was to destroy her credibility before she could release the documents. Victoria read every line with cold precision. Then she called Daniel and showed him the content. He looked at her for a long second before suggesting she move first, call an emergency shareholders meeting, and lay everything out. Either they'd control the narrative or they'd lose their grip on it entirely. Victoria nodded in agreement. The meeting was scheduled for the following Friday. That left 4 days. During that time, Victoria barely slept. Between legal briefings, strategy sessions, and speech rehearsals, she did her best to keep things functioning at home. Emily, despite their efforts, grew more restless. She stopped drawing, picked at her meals, and cried at odd moments. Daniel took over drop-offs and pickups at school, shielding her from the worst of the storm. One evening over dinner, he suggested they spend the following weekend in Vermont, away from the city's noise. Victoria hesitated, saying she couldn't leave the company in the middle of a crisis. Daniel didn't press her, but the look in his eyes made it clear. The gap between what she defended and what she felt was beginning to take a toll. On Friday, the shareholders' meeting was held in a large conference room on the top floor of the headquarters. The major investors arrived in small groups, speaking in low tones. Dressed in a navy blue blazer, Victoria opened the session with authority. She presented the auditor's findings, projected performance charts, and read a loud excerpt from the intercepted emails. She didn't name Laurent directly, but his allies understood the implications. One board member tried to challenge the document's legitimacy. Victoria countered with verification records, authenticated by 2 independent agencies. When it came time to vote, the majority supported her continued leadership and approved the suspension of the implicated board members. Leaving the room, Victoria didn't celebrate. She simply took a deep breath and walked toward the elevator where Daniel was waiting. On the ride home, no one spoke of what had just happened. Emily had fallen asleep in the back seat. Daniel kept his hands steady on the wheel while Victoria stared out at the city gliding past. When they arrived, Emily stirred at a gentle nudge and asked for cereal. Daniel took her into the kitchen. Victoria headed upstairs, slipped off her shoes, and sat on the edge of the bed, holding her phone but not touching it. She knew the hardest part was still ahead, but for the first time there was a break in the wall that had closed in around them. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was space. And in that space, she could finally breathe a little easier. The days following the board vote were marked by a blend of relief and unease. Victoria carried out her routine with precision, but something in her demeanor had begun to soften. It wasn't weakness. It was the reflection of accumulated exhaustion, of a clarity that was becoming more personal than strategic. Daniel saw it in the small details. The way she set her cup on the table more slowly, the way she watched Emily not just with protectiveness, but with a kind of wonder. He remained her steady support, quiet but present. Not just the man who had entered contract, but someone who was slowly losing the ability to tell where agreement ended and real feeling began. On Friday night, after a simple dinner they prepared together, Emily fell asleep early. Victoria and Daniel stayed in the kitchen, sitting side by side. She got up to do the dishes, and he followed, drying each one without being asked. When they finished, Victoria turned to face him, pausing for a few seconds with her gaze locked on his. There was no urgency in the moment. Daniel raised his hand and gently touched her cheek, as if asking permission without saying a word. Victoria didn't pull away. She leaned in slowly and pressed her lips to his in a restrained kiss that carried everything they'd avoided naming until then. In the days that followed, they said nothing about it, but the air between them had shifted. They still respected the boundaries of the house and Emily's routine, but their touches lingered longer, and their glances searched for reassurance. The little girl, always attuned, seemed lighter somehow, as if the atmosphere had quietly told her she now had permission to truly belong. Noticing this, Victoria began to include Daniel more naturally in everyday decisions. Daniel, in turn, found himself torn between wanting to give in and fearing there were still invisible barriers. But the truth was, even without definitive conversations, they were building something real. On Monday, Victoria received a call from the prosecutor handling the Laurent case. The documents she had provided had prompted the opening of a formal investigation, and new subpoenas would soon be issued. She thanked him and hung up, then sat on the edge of the bed, still holding the phone in her hands. Daniel walked in with a tray of coffee and placed it quietly on the table before sitting next to her. Victoria shared everything: updates from the legal front, possible market reactions, and the risk of retaliation. He said nothing, only held her hand firmly, letting her know she wasn't alone. On Wednesday evening, Victoria suggested they take a short weekend trip, just the three of them. Autumn was in full color in Vermont, and Emily loved crunching through dry leaves and going on long walks. Daniel agreed right away, unable to hide his quiet excitement. On Saturday morning, they left in a rented car with light luggage and unspoken promises of rest. Emily fell asleep about an hour into the drive, and Victoria, her head resting on Daniel's shoulder, spoke for the first time about fear, not of professional failure, but of not knowing how to love without filtering everything through duty. Daniel didn't answer with words. He simply reached for her hand and laced his fingers with hers. Along that road, surrounded by oranges and browns, winding turns and open skies, there was more than just an escape. There was a beginning. When they arrived at the rented cabin, Emily ran off to claim the smallest bedroom. Victoria laughed, really laughed for the first time in a long while. That night, by the fire, Daniel moved toward her again and kissed her, this time slowly, with presence. Victoria responded without hesitation, and for the first time, neither of them thought about the contract. What they were building no longer depended on clauses. It was a living choice, made with each shared gesture. The morning in Vermont began with the smell of fresh coffee and the sound of Emily playing with fallen leaves in the cabin's backyard. Victoria stepped out of the bedroom with her hair loose, wrapped in a wool sweater Daniel had left draped over the chair. He was already on the porch, looking out at the landscape with the calm expression of someone who had finally found a pause in the chaos. When she joined him, no words were needed. He simply reached out his hand, and she took it, sitting beside him with ease. In that quiet gesture, without formal promises or romantic illusions, there was a truth deeper than any agreement they had ever signed. The weekend was brief, but it marked a turning point. Between walks in the woods and homemade meals prepared side by side, they didn't speak about the company, the investigation, or the past that still lingered around them. Emily collected rocks and leaves, made up stories, and laughed with ease. Watching her like that, Victoria understood something new. That despite all she had fought for, her reputation, her empire, her sense of control, what truly held her up wasn't built on the foundations of the market, but on the tangible life taking shape between the three of them. Daniel knew it too. He felt it in her small, unspoken choices, the ones that didn't need discussion to be understood. On Monday, back in New York, Victoria returned to her executive role with a renewed outlook. She called a press conference to deliver an official statement, reaffirming the Hayes Group's commitment to transparency and announcing a restructuring of its internal governance. She didn't name names or reveal details, but made it clear that from that day forward, company practices would follow a new ethical code. As she spoke, Daniel watched from home with Emily in his lap, answering her questions with patience. When Victoria came home, she was met with a simple dinner already prepared and a proud little girl wearing an apron smudged with tomato sauce, excited to say she had helped cut the vegetables. That night, Victoria and Daniel talked in their room about the future. No big declarations, no grand plans. They spoke of Emily, of the contract that would now officially end, and with it, the public facade they had built together. Victoria asked if he wanted to leave the home, the life, the ties that had slowly formed around them. Daniel said he had nowhere else to go because he was already exactly where he wanted to be. She smiled, a small, quiet smile, but full of meaning. They kissed gently, and when they lay down together, it wasn't out of need or impulse. It was a mutual, conscious choice. In the days that followed, quiet changes began to settle in. Daniel started appearing at the company headquarters as a strategic security consultant. Emily transferred to a smaller school, where she quickly made friends and began drawing again. Claire moved away from the city, but stayed in touch, always discreet. Corporate tension still existed, but Victoria had learned to distinguish between what demanded her energy and what could be entrusted to others. Her relationship with Daniel was no longer a secret nor a scandal. It was simply a reality, built on mutual respect and shaped by choices rooted in affection, not urgency. One afternoon, months later, Victoria received a letter from her grandfather's attorney. It was an addendum to the will that had not been previously disclosed. In it, the old patriarch wrote that more than preserving the family name, he had hoped she would find someone she didn't have to fight beside every day, someone who wouldn't be an extension of her ambition, but a companion in her silences. Victoria read those words while sitting on a garden bench, Emily playing in the grass, and Daniel reading a book a few feet away. She folded the letter, slipped it into her pocket, and stood up to join them. Emily called her to play. Daniel reached out a hand to help her sit on the ground. And she went without hesitation, because after so many battles, she had finally discovered that continuing was also a choice, and that sometimes love is born right in the space between what was never planned and what, at last, makes perfect sense. The end. What did you think of this story? Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. See you next time.